Ethan Whitaker's boots clanged against the metallic floor of the Shahran flagship as he stepped off the transport shuttle. The vast docking bay hummed with the activity of technicians and soldiers, their towering feline forms moving with purposeful grace. The Shahrans, a species known for their sharp reflexes, fierce independence, and steely dispositions, barely glanced at the human delegation as they disembarked. Ethan's commanding officer, a middle-aged diplomat named Harper Kane, muttered something under his breath. "Why do I get the feeling we're not exactly welcome?" Harper said, adjusting his uniform. Ethan smirked. "Maybe it's the fact that we're here to tell them how to run their clans." "Diplomacy isn't about telling anyone anything," Harper snapped. "It's about helping them see our perspective. You do well to remember that." Ethan kept his grin to himself. The older man's strict adherence to protocol was almost endearing. Almost. He knew full well that the Shahrans didn't care about human bureaucracy or diplomatic niceties. They respected action, strength, and results, not endless speeches and polite phrases. As the delegation moved forward, a group of Shahran warriors approached. At their head was Athera, one of the most feared leaders among the coalition. She was taller than the rest, her sleek gray fur marked with battle scars that shimmered faintly under the docking bay's harsh lights. Her piercing yellow eyes swept over the humans, stopping briefly on Ethan. A small, disdainful twitch of her whiskers was the only indication that she'd noticed him. "Welcome to the flagship of the Shahran coalition," Athera said, her voice a low, resonant growl. "Your presence here is a rare occurrence. Let us hope it is not a wasted one." Harper stepped forward, bowing slightly. "Thank you for hosting us, Commander Athera. We are honored to be you." "Spare me the pleasantries," she interrupted. "The council chamber is ready. If you have words to share, say them there." Ethan exchanged a quick glance with Harper, who pursed his lips but said nothing more. They followed Athera and her entourage into the corridors of the ship, the humans struggling to keep pace with the long strides of their hosts. Ethan couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. The Shahrans clearly weren't interested in forming any sort of bond, and the humans, in turn, seemed content to tread carefully. Their destination was an expansive chamber at the heart of the flagship. A massive round table dominated the room, surrounded by ornate chairs designed to accommodate the Shahrans' larger frames. Athera gestured for the humans to sit. Ethan found himself at her immediate right, the closest any human had ever been to one of their council leaders. "Let's begin," Athera said. "We understand you come seeking an alliance, yet you bring no gifts, no show of strength. Why should the Shahran coalition bother listening to you?" Harper cleared his throat. "Commander Athera, we believe that cooperation between our species would be mutually beneficial. The human colonies have resources and technology that—" "What your colonies have," Athera interrupted, her sharp gaze fixed on Ethan, "is arrogance. You assume that because we tolerate your presence, we must need what you offer, that we cannot achieve it ourselves." Ethan leaned forward. "It's not arrogance. It's practicality. Working together could save lives, Shahran and human. You're strong, but strength doesn't mean you have to stand alone." Athera's ears twitched, and for a moment her intense stare softened. "A curious notion. Strength and unity. And yet you send diplomats instead of warriors." "We're here to prevent bloodshed," Ethan said. "A warrior can end a conflict, sure. But we can stop it before it starts." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Athera regarded him carefully, as if sizing him up in a way she hadn't before. Ethan could see the gears turning in her mind. She wasn't just a soldier, she was a strategist. And strategy, he knew, often relied on seeing the bigger picture. "Very well," she said finally. "We will hear what you have to say. But understand this, the Shahran coalition does not bend to outsiders. If your words prove hollow, your presence here will end. Permanently." Ethan inclined his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Understood." As the meeting continued, the other Shahran council members joined the discussion. Ethan quickly realized that they weren't the monolithic group he'd imagined. Some were staunch traditionalists who viewed humans as little more than a nuisance, while others seemed more open-minded, curious about what the humans could bring to the table. Ethan made it a point to listen carefully, picking up on subtle cues, reading between the lines. One council member, a grizzled Shahran named Vielek, voiced concerns about human intentions. "You claim to want peace, yet your kind has expanded rapidly into sectors we once considered neutral territory. What assurances do we have that you won't push further?" Harper began to respond, but Ethan interjected. "We'll commit to shared governance of contested zones. Neutral zones will remain neutral with oversight from both our species. If we step out of line, we'll answer to the coalition." Vielek's ears flattened, his tail twitching. "And how do we enforce this oversight?" "By holding each other accountable," Ethan said simply. "If we fail, you'll know." If you fail, we'll know. And we'll call it out. Publicly. Transparently. Vielek narrowed his eyes but said nothing more. Athera, watching the exchange, leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. By the end of the meeting, no formal agreement had been reached, but Ethan had planted a seed. He'd spoken the truth, not just the scripted diplomacy that Harper so carefully rehearsed. And that truth, he could tell, had struck a chord. As the humans prepared to leave, Athera approached Ethan directly. Harper and the others had already stepped out, leaving the two of them alone in the council chamber. "You speak boldly for one so fragile," she said, her voice low. "I speak boldly because it matters," Ethan replied. "It's not about strength alone. It's about trust." Athera tilted her head, regarding him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Trust is earned, not given. Then I'll earn it." For a moment, Athera said nothing. Then she turned and walked away, her tail flicking behind her. Ethan stood there, the empty council chamber echoing with the weight of his resolve. He knew this was only the beginning of a long and challenging journey, but he also knew he wasn't alone in it. The alliance was far from certain, but at least now there was a chance to build something stronger together. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed after the initial meeting. Athera's parting words had stuck with him, echoing in his thoughts as the days passed. She was skeptical, yes, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her sharp eyes, something that hinted she wasn't entirely closed off to the idea of collaboration. That small opening was enough for Ethan. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but that was fine. Easy had never been part of his vocabulary. The human delegation was assigned quarters deep within the Shar-An flagship. Their section was sparse, consisting of utilitarian metal walls, a single long table for meals, and simple bunks stacked against the far bulkhead. Ethan didn't mind the Spartan accommodations. He'd slept in worse places during his days on Earth's outer colonies. What mattered now was forging a genuine partnership, something more substantial than an exchange of diplomatic niceties. Harper was less optimistic. "I don't like the way they look at us," he muttered one evening as they sat down for a quick meal of protein rations. "They don't respect humans. You saw how they ignored most of what we said in the council chamber. They're testing us," Ethan said simply. "They want to see what we're made of." Harper huffed, taking a swig from his water canister. "You sound awfully sure of yourself. What makes you think we'll pass their test?" Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Because we're willing to do more than just talk. We're going to show them we can pull our weight. They may not trust us yet, but they'll come around." "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Harper asked, raising an eyebrow. "By helping," Ethan said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "The Shar-Ans have problems of their own. If we prove we can solve those problems, they'll start seeing us differently." Harper shook his head. "You're playing a dangerous game. The moment they think we're overstepping, they'll shut us out." Ethan shrugged. "Or maybe they'll realize we're worth keeping around." Not long after, the opportunity presented itself. Word came from one of the Shar-An technicians, a large male named Arelon, that a critical part of the flagship's agricultural system had failed. It wasn't just a minor inconvenience. The hydroponic bays that supplied the ship's fresh produce were under threat, and if the issue wasn't resolved quickly, the entire crew's food supply would be compromised. The Shar-Ans were scrambling to find a solution, but the part they needed wasn't something they had on hand. "Sounds like they could use a hand," Ethan remarked when the news reached their quarters. Harper sighed. "Ethan, don't." "I'm not sitting here while they struggle," Ethan cut him off. "If we can fix it, we fix it. Simple as that." Before Harper could argue further, Ethan was already heading toward the hydroponic bays. He didn't bother to ask permission, he knew it wouldn't come. Instead, he relied on a different strategy, getting to the heart of the problem before anyone had time to question why a human was sticking his nose into Shar-An affairs. Arelon met him near the bay's entrance, his fur bristling with agitation. The Shar-An technician was nearly twice Ethan's size, with thick arms and a perpetual scowl that seemed to have deepened since their last encounter. "What are you doing here, human?" Arelon growled. "I heard you've got a busted module," Ethan said calmly. "Figured I could help." Arelon's ears flattened in irritation. "You think you can fix something our engineers cannot?" Ethan smiled. "Maybe not, but I've worked on similar systems back home. Let me take a look." Arelon hesitated, his golden eyes narrowing. "If you make it worse, I'll have you removed." "Fair enough," Ethan said, stepping past the hulking Shar-An. "Just point me to the problem." Inside, the hydroponic bay was a jungle of vertical grow panels, dripping irrigation lines, and faintly glowing nutrient tanks. The air was humid and thick with the scent of plant life. Ethan quickly spotted the malfunctioning module, a cracked pressure regulator on one of the primary nutrient pumps. He crouched down, inspecting the damage while Arelon loomed over him. This unit was designed for high-capacity flows, Arelon said. We replaced it once before, but it failed again after only a few cycles. Ethan ran his fingers along the edge of the cracked housing. Your replacement was probably too brittle for the flow rate. Did you try reinforcing the seals? Arelon snorted. We are not novices. Of course we reinforced them. Then you used the wrong material, Ethan replied without looking up. You need something that can flex with the pressure changes, probably a composite alloy. I can rig a temporary patch, but you'll need to fabricate a better part soon. Arelon folded his massive arms, still skeptical. A temporary patch will not last. It'll buy you time, Ethan said, standing up. Better than waiting for the system to fail completely. Arelon stared at him for a long moment before grunting. Do what you must. Ethan worked quickly, using what tools and materials he could scrounge up. He cut and shaped a piece of flexible polymer to fit over the cracked regulator housing, securing it with a series of fasteners and a heat seal compound. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold until the Charans could fabricate a proper replacement. When he finished, he stepped back and gestured for Arelon to test the system. The Charan technician activated the pump. There was a brief hum followed by a steady flow of nutrient-rich water through the lines. No leaks, no pressure spikes, just smooth operation. Arelon's ears flicked in surprise. It works, Arelon admitted grudgingly. You were right. Ethan smiled. Glad I could help. Just remember, you'll need to replace it soon. This is just a stopgap. Arelon nodded, his expression softening slightly. You have my thanks, human. From that day forward, the tension between Ethan and the Charans began to ease. Arelon, who had been openly hostile before, now treated Ethan with a measure of respect. The Charans still had their doubts about the human's motives, but Ethan's willingness to roll up his sleeves and solve a problem had made an impression. When word of the repair reached Athera, she sought out Ethan personally. She found him in the corridor outside the hydroponic bay, checking a data pad for system updates. You took a risk, she said, her voice low but steady. Ethan looked up, meeting her gaze. It paid off. Athera's ears twitched. You could have been expelled from the ship for interfering in our operations. But I wasn't, he replied. I saw a problem and I fixed it. That's what I do. She studied him for a moment as if trying to decide whether to be impressed or annoyed. Finally, she gave a slight nod. Perhaps your kind is not as useless as I thought. Ethan chuckled. That's the nicest thing anyone's said to me all week. Athera didn't smile, Charans rarely did, but her tone softened. You've earned a measure of trust, Ethan Whitaker. Do not squander it. Wouldn't dream of it, he said, watching as she turned and walked away. For the first time since arriving on the Charan flagship, Ethan felt a spark of genuine connection. It wasn't just about negotiations or formal agreements. It was about action, showing that humans and Charans could stand side by side, solving problems and building something greater together. The path ahead was still uncertain, but now it seemed a little less daunting. Ethan's relationship with the Charans, while still uneasy, had taken a surprising turn. After proving himself capable of more than polite diplomacy, he found himself increasingly drawn into their world. He continued working alongside Arelon in the hydroponic bays, learning the intricacies of Charan engineering. In exchange, he shared his knowledge of human technology, offering insights that even the proud Charans reluctantly acknowledged were useful. One afternoon, as Ethan replaced a failing irrigation line, Arelon leaned against a bulkhead, watching him work. The Charan technician still wore his usual scowl, but there was a hint of curiosity in his expression. You adapt quickly for a human, Arelon said gruffly. Grew up on the frontier, Ethan replied without looking up. Had to learn fast or get left behind. Frontier. Arelon's ears twitched. Explain. Ethan paused, wiping sweat from his brow. My parents were colonists. We lived on the edge of settled space, no big cities, no fancy infrastructure. If something broke, we fixed it ourselves. If we needed something, we built it. That's how I learned my way around machines. Arelon grunted. Your world sounds harsh. It was, Ethan admitted. But it taught me to keep moving forward, no matter what. Arelon seemed to consider this, then nodded slowly. Perhaps that is why you have earned Athera's attention. Ethan looked up, surprised. Athera's attention? What do you mean? Arelon's tail flicked. She has watched you closely since your arrival. Not just your actions, but your intent. Athera is not one to waste time on the weak. Not sure how much attention she's really paying, Ethan said, turning back to his work. She probably just wants to make sure I don't screw up. Perhaps, Arelon said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Later that evening, Ethan was summoned to the council chamber. This time, however, it wasn't for a formal meeting. Athra stood alone near the massive round table, her arms crossed, her yellow eyes fixed on a large holographic display. As Ethan approached, she glanced at him but said nothing. "You wanted to see me?" Ethan asked. Athra nodded toward the display. "Our scouts have reported increased pirate activity near a key supply route. If we do not address it, our food shipments will be at risk." Ethan studied the map, his brow furrowing. Pirates don't usually hit coalition ships. They'd have to be desperate. "Desperate or bold," Athra said. "Either way, we must act. And you need me for." Athra turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Your kind has dealt with piracy before. Your insight could prove valuable." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I thought the Sharans didn't need help from humans." Her ears twitched slightly, a gesture he'd come to recognize as irritation. "I am not asking for help. I am seeking perspective." "Fair enough," Ethan said, leaning closer to the display. "Show me what you've got." For the next several hours, the two of them pored over the data, ship manifests, patrol routes, and pirate activity logs. Athra was methodical and sharp, pointing out patterns that even the Sharan analysts had missed. Ethan, in turn, offered suggestions on how to disrupt the pirates' supply chain and bait them into an ambush. Their styles were different, Athra's direct and aggressive, Ethan's more subtle and flexible, but together they formed a plan that neither would have developed alone. As they worked, the conversation drifted beyond tactics. Athra asked about Ethan's time on the frontier, about the challenges he'd faced and the skills he'd gained. In return, Ethan asked about her rise through the Sharan ranks, about the battles she'd fought and the lessons she'd learned. Though their backgrounds couldn't have been more different, they found common ground in their shared experiences of struggle and perseverance. "You must have faced some pretty tough odds," Ethan said as he adjusted the display's filters. "Climbing the ranks in a society that values strength above all else." Athra's ears flicked. "Strength is not just physical. It is the will to endure, to outthink one's rivals, to earn the respect of those who would challenge you." Ethan nodded. "Sounds like you've been doing that your whole life." Athra's gaze turned distant. "It is exhausting." He looked at her, surprised by the honesty in her tone. "You don't have to carry it all alone, you know." Her yellow eyes met his, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of saying something more. But instead, she straightened and gestured toward the map. "Enough talk. Let us finalize the plan." Ethan smiled. "Yes, Commander." The plan, once approved, was set into motion quickly. Athra led a small task force to intercept the pirates, using the strategies she and Ethan had developed. The operation went smoothly, too smoothly, in fact. The pirates took the bait without hesitation, falling into the Sharan's trap almost too easily. Athra's warriors subdued the attackers without a single casualty, and the coalition's supply route was secured once more. When the dust settled, Athra returned to the flagship, her expression as calm and composed as ever. But as she stepped into the corridor outside the council chamber, "Etha, you were the one who made it happen." Athra regarded him quietly, her tail swishing behind her. "You are not like the others." "What, the other humans?" Ethan asked. "No," she said. "The other Sharans." The statement caught him off guard, and for a moment he wasn't sure how to respond. But then he smiled, a hint of warmth in his expression. "I'll take that as a compliment." Athra tilted her head slightly, her ears twitching. "You should." As she walked away, Ethan felt a strange sense of satisfaction. He hadn't set out to earn Athra's respect, but it seemed he had done so regardless. More importantly, he'd proven that humans and Sharans could work together, not as competitors, but as allies with a shared purpose. Back in his quarters, Ethan sat on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The mission had gone well, but something about it still lingered in his mind. Athra's words, her willingness to share even a small piece of her burden, it was more than he'd expected. Maybe this alliance was about more than just politics and logistics. Maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something greater. Ethan had always believed that trust wasn't something you simply asked for, it was something you earned. Over the past few months aboard the Sharan flagship, he had earned it not through bold speeches or grand gestures, but by consistently showing up and doing the work. What had started as a cold, wary partnership had grown into something more substantial. The Sharans still didn't fully embrace him, he doubted they ever would, but they no longer looked at him as an intruder. It was Athra, though, who had surprised him most. The fierce warrior leader had gone from outright skepticism to quiet respect. They had spent countless hours in strategy sessions, each learning from the other's perspective. She had come to appreciate his human ingenuity, his knack for thinking around obstacles rather than charging straight through them. And he had come to admire her unwavering determination and razor-sharp intellect. Ethan, Athera said one day as they worked side by side in the flagship's central data hub. I have a question. Shoot, he said, not looking up from the interface he was calibrating. Why do you trust so easily? Her question made him pause. He glanced at her, surprised by the genuine curiosity in her voice. Do I? You do, she said. You step into our world without hesitation. You offer help without demanding anything in return. Why? Ethan thought about it for a moment. I guess it's just the way I was raised. You get what you give. If you trust people, most of the time they'll trust you back. Sure, it doesn't always work out, but it's better than living in fear or suspicion. Athera studied him, her yellow eyes sharp and unreadable. Your way is strange to me. How so? In my world, trust is a rare thing. It must be proven over and over again. Even then, it can be taken away in an instant. We do not assume good intentions. Well, Ethan said with a small smile, maybe I'm just an optimist. She tilted her head. An optimist? Yeah, he said. I like to believe things will work out if you give them a chance. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. But it keeps me going. Athera didn't reply right away. Instead, she turned back to the interface they were working on, her expression thoughtful. It wasn't often that she revealed much about herself, but Ethan could tell his answer had given her something to consider. Over the next several weeks, their working relationship grew even closer. The Sharan coalition faced a series of logistical challenges, disrupted supply lines, disputes among the clans, and escalating tensions with a nearby neutral faction. Athera and Ethan tackled each problem together, combining her decisive leadership with his creative problem-solving. They had different approaches. She was direct and unyielding, he was more flexible and willing to improvise, but together they found solutions that neither could have achieved alone. One evening, after a particularly tense negotiation with the neutral faction, Athera invited Ethan to join her for a rare moment of quiet. They met in one of the ship's observation lounges, a small chamber with a clear view of the stars. Ethan had never been up here before. Sharans valued their privacy, and humans were rarely allowed into such personal spaces. As they sat by the window, the endless expanse of space stretched out before them. Ethan leaned back in his chair, letting the silence settle between them. Athera, always composed, sat with her hands resting on her knees, her gaze fixed on the stars. This is where I come to think, she said after a long moment. It's a good spot, Ethan replied. Peaceful. She nodded. It is necessary at times. They fell silent again, the quiet hum of the ship the only sound. Finally, Athera turned to him. You have changed the way I see your people. Ethan raised an eyebrow. How so? I believed humans were weak. Short-lived. Too fragile to endure the challenges we face. But you have proven otherwise. You have shown strength not in battle, but in persistence. In adaptability. Well, Ethan said with a grin, I'm glad to hear I'm not entirely useless. Athera's ears twitched, a faint hint of amusement crossing her face. You have also taught me something unexpected. What's that? He asked, curious. That strength is not always loud. It is not always forceful. Sometimes it is quiet, patient, and deeply enduring. Ethan looked at her, struck by the weight of her words. I think you already knew that, he said after a moment. You just needed someone to remind you. She held his gaze, her expression softening. Perhaps. There was something in the air between them, something unspoken but undeniable. A connection that had grown stronger with each challenge they faced together. It wasn't just trust anymore. It was something more. Athera leaned slightly closer, her yellow eyes searching his face. Ethan. Yeah, he said, his voice low. Thank you. The words were simple, but coming from Athera, they carried a depth that few ever heard. Ethan felt a warmth spread through him, a warmth he hadn't expected. He reached out, gently placing a hand over hers. Her fur was soft, her claws sharp, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand slightly, her palm meeting his. In that quiet moment, with the stars as their only witnesses, they found a new understanding. No words were needed. Their connection had grown beyond words, built on trust, respect, and the quiet strength they both carried within them. It had been another long day aboard the Sharan flagship. The coalition's ongoing negotiations with the neutral faction had hit yet another snag, and Athera's patience was wearing thin. Ethan could see it in the way her tail flicked sharply whenever someone mentioned the neutral faction's latest demands. Her voice, usually steady and measured, had gained a faint edge. Yet, she held her composure in public, refusing to let her frustrations show in front of her council members. Ethan found her later in the observation lounge, staring out at the stars. This had become her retreat, a place to find solitude and clarity. He hesitated at the entrance, unsure if she wanted company. But then she glanced over her shoulder and gestured for him to join her. Rough day? He asked as he approached. Atheros' ears twitched. You could say that. Those neutral faction reps are a real pain, Ethan said, leaning against the rail beside her. They keep moving the goalposts. One day it's resource access, the next it's territorial boundaries. They are testing our resolve, Athera said, her voice low. They wish to see how far we are willing to bend. Ethan smirked. Seems like they've already stretched us pretty far. Athera turned to him, her yellow eyes piercing. And yet you continue to remain calm. How do you manage it? I wouldn't say I'm calm, Ethan admitted. I just don't let it get to me. I've seen enough tense negotiations to know that getting angry doesn't help. You have to keep your cool even when they're pushing all your buttons. Athera studied him for a moment before nodding. I suppose that is something I could learn from you. He chuckled. You learn from me? I thought you had everything figured out. No one has everything figured out, she said simply. Not even me. They fell into a companionable silence, the stars casting a soft glow over the room. After a moment, Athera spoke again. You've been helpful during these negotiations, she said. Your perspective has been refreshing. Glad I could help, Ethan replied. You've taught me a thing or two as well. Like how to handle a room full of skeptical council members without breaking a sweat. A faint smile tugged at Athera's lips. That comes with experience. Maybe, he said. But it also comes from having the right attitude. You command respect. People listen to you because they know you mean what you say. She inclined her head slightly. And you. People listen to you because you have a way of finding solutions no one else sees. Ethan shrugged. Just a knack I picked up growing up on the frontier. Your frontier stories always intrigue me, Athera said. Perhaps one day you will tell me more. Sure, he said, a playful grin on his face. But only if you tell me more about the battles you've fought. I bet you've got some great stories. Her ears twitched in amusement. Perhaps. They continued talking late into the night, sharing stories of their pasts, their struggles, and their victories. Ethan told her about the time he and his brother had repaired a derelict freighter with little more than scrap metal and ingenuity. Athera recounted a fierce duel she had fought to defend her clan's honor, a duel that had earned her the respect of even her most staunch rivals. As the hours passed, their conversation grew more personal. Athera admitted that leadership, while fulfilling, often left her feeling isolated. She spoke of the weight of responsibility, the constant need to appear strong and unshakable. I envy you, she said at one point. You can show weakness without fear of losing respect. Ethan frowned. I wouldn't say that. People look up to me too, and if I screw up, it can still hurt my credibility. But I guess I've learned that it's okay to be human, to admit when you're tired or overwhelmed. Sometimes showing that side of yourself makes people trust you more. Athera nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps I have been too rigid. Hey, Ethan said, nudging her arm gently. You've done a damn good job leading your people. But you don't have to carry it all alone. You've got allies now. Me, for one. Her gaze softened. You are unlike anyone I have ever known, Ethan. He felt a warmth spread through him at her words. You're not so bad yourself. They sat in silence for a while longer, the stars shimmering outside the viewport. It was a rare moment of peace, one that both of them knew would be fleeting. But in that moment, they found solace in each other's presence. Athera reached out, her large hand resting on Ethan's smaller one. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, her claws carefully tucked away. Ethan looked down at their joined hands, then up at her. She was watching him intently, her expression unreadable. Ethan, she said softly, you have given me something I did not expect. What's that? He asked, his voice equally quiet. Understanding, she said. A connection. In all my years, I have never felt this closeness with another. He swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. But then he simply smiled and squeezed her hand. I feel it too. Athera leaned closer, her sharp, feline features softening. Ethan could feel the heat radiating from her, the subtle strength that made her so formidable. And yet, in that moment, she wasn't the fearsome Sharan commander. She was just Athera, a woman reaching out for something more. When their lips met, it was slow and tentative. Her rough, feline mouth pressed against his softer, human one, and for a moment, the differences between them melted away. Ethan felt her hand move to his shoulder, her touch firm but careful. He reached up to cup her cheek, his fingers brushing against the smooth fur along her jawline. They stayed like that for a long time, caught in a moment that neither of them had anticipated. It wasn't just a kiss, it was an acknowledgement of the bond they had built, a bridge between two very different worlds. When they finally pulled back, Athera's eyes met his, and he saw something new in her gaze. It wasn't just respect or admiration. It was something deeper. You mean more to me than I ever thought possible, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan smiled. You're not getting rid of me now. Her ears flicked in amusement. Good. They sat together, their hands still entwined, watching the stars. In that moment, the challenges they faced seemed a little less daunting. Together, they knew they could handle whatever came next.